Building content and solutions people will actually use, if that's what you're here for, great. Thank you for coming. We got a full room, so thank you to those who are willing to stand through this session. If not, sorry, you might be stuck here. So a little bit about me. My name is Jay Lindeman. I am an advisor, or what we call an advisor of analytic ops and business intelligence. What that essentially means is I'm an analytics solutions architect. I focus a lot on automation and self-service. We are at Priority Health, and I'll talk about them in a second here. We're really aspiring to do more with analytic solutions, analytic app development, automation, workflows, things like that. So I've been given the opportunity to focus primarily on that work, and so it's been really fun for me. Additionally, I am the Corewell Health Tableau trainer. I'm an Alteryx evangelist, and I am really new to Power BI, but it's a lot of fun learning into that platform. So yeah, I get to dabble in a lot of different things. Priority Health, if you're not familiar, is a part of Corewell Health. So if you're familiar with that organization, they're one of the largest Michigan-based employers. We are a health insurance organization, and so a couple things we're super proud of. We're the second largest in the state. We serve over 1 million members, so we're a pretty large organization and growing. And something that's, I think, pretty remarkable from a health insurance standpoint is 90 cents of every dollar that we take in goes back into the provider's pockets, right? So we're focusing our dollars on care, and that's something that we're really proud of. So if you haven't heard about us, feel free to come talk to me afterwards or look us up. Again, Michigan-based Priority Health, part of Corewell Health. Session overview, we're not going to go over this. This is really here for those who get access to the slides, want to make sure that we have an understanding of what we're doing today, but getting to the key takeaways, right? So what are we here to focus on? We are trying to create analytic solutions that people will actually use. So if you're here, I think you fit into 3 categories of people. The first category are my friends, so thank you for coming and supporting me. The second category is you're a developer. You created something that nobody used, and you're trying to figure out how to provoke more utilization and use out of that asset. And the third camp is maybe you're on the user side, and you have been presented with a solution and you found this didn't quite meet my needs, and what maybe could I have done differently or earlier in that development cycle to try to help promote more usage for the time that's obviously spent to develop these things. So what we're going to talk about here is everything affects usage, right? So we have the ability as developers to positively or negatively impact that usage, and we're going to talk about all the different things along the way that we can do to influence that. We need to get comfortable with the idea of failing fast and moving forward. So this is rooted in communication. This is rooted in collaboration. We want to make sure that we are understanding where we need to make changes along the way iteratively so that we don't get stuck with a whole bunch of design debt. And we want to make sure that we are user-centric, right? So we want to design things that are purpose-built for the user or the audience that it's intended for so that they feel like they're being catered to, therefore they ultimately use what you're building, right? So those are the goals, those are the things we want to focus on. Okay, so why is it important to build useful solutions, right? And I think this is the obvious slide. I think this is the one that's sort of like the duh moment, but I think it's worth stating, right? Development is resource intensive. You're gonna spend a lot of time building things. There's time, money, resources that go into that. You don't want it to be wasted. You know, you want that to be valuable, you want it to be used. So we need to make sure that we're thinking about building solutions that are actually gonna get used to solve problems, right? That's pretty intuitive. Number 2 is a little different, right? We hear a lot about data-driven, but I want to suggest that domain-driven, data-supported is also a pretty important concept for us to consider when building solutions that are oriented towards the customer. Your customer or your internal stakeholder, the people that are going to use your asset, they ultimately drive that business forward. They're going to be making those decisions, and they have domain expertise. So they're your conduit to understanding what problems exist out there. So I want to suggest to you that domain-driven is just as important as data-driven. We can make sure that we can derive things from the data first, and we can also do that from the domain. So I don't want to forget about that in the continuum of data use. Information immediacy, right? We want to make sure that we're getting information into people's hands. We want to get it to them fast. We want to have near or real-time data. So our self-service solutions, our applications are intended to do that. We are trying to get information out there so people can make quick decisions and hopefully do that autonomously or self-driven. And then obviously from a developer standpoint, we want to extend our reach, right? Extend that bandwidth. How can we do more with the same resources that we have? So these are the goals that we're going to keep in mind as we're going through all the different inflection points about how we can influence use within our solutions. So stack the cards in our favor, right? Demystifying the significance of building content. We are going to go over these different categorical areas. We want to understand things that impede usage. We're going to talk about the differences between where the request comes from, whether it's customer or developer derived. We're going to spend a lot of time on the development lifecycle and looking at all the different areas that can influence usage. Communication feedback loops, focused on value, and then the reinforcement piece. So those are the areas that we're going to talk about today. All right, so to begin, let's think about some of the obstacles, right? Data literacy is something that we hear a lot about. And really what that means is our ability to understand what the data is and what it means. Now, data literacy is not just about the data, it's also about the solution literacy. Do you build things that people can actually intuitively use and understand? You have to consider both of those in there, because if they don't understand the data, or if they don't understand the solution or your interpretation of the data, you're going to see a drop-off in usage. People are going to be fearful of that. That gets into the next three categories, which are sort of related to each other. Time management, and I don't mean that in the traditional sense. I mean that literally some people use questions and analytics to buy them time to delay making a decision. So we're talking about like anti-time management here. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but I have certainly been asked to create reports, create dashboards, applications, or solutions simply to buy my customer more time. It's frustrating. It does happen though. So we need to be mindful of that. Imposter syndrome feeds into that, right? So people will hide behind the idea that they don't understand the data. So they need all of these analytical packages to help demystify, to help them get more comfortable so that they can ultimately make that decision. But we know that all of that analytic insight, all of that BI isn't necessarily going to help them if they don't understand the data or have a confidence in what they're speaking about. Again, it's another stall tactic that we need to be aware of. These are not necessarily reasons to not do the work, but it does help us understand how to interact with our audience better. Transient or fake engagement. Fake engagement, I think, goes along with those previous 2 points, but transient engagement, I think, is a newer term that many of you may not have heard about. And this is the phenomenon of, I need a solution because today's fire drill is what I'm dealing with, and as soon as I solve that problem or move on from that fire, there's another fire that I have to pay attention to. And sometimes this is going to create disengagement of your solution or asset, or at least momentary disengagement. That's probably the most healthy derivative of lack of engagement for solutions, but it's something we need to be mindful of, because we're going to start to assess whether or not the usage and utilization is healthy or not healthy to help us understand where we need to focus. And then first impressions matter, right? When we're building solutions, you have to consider the idea that you have a brand and an identity for what you are doing, who you are, and how you represent. I think we all know from a code standpoint or a design standpoint, we all sort of have a signature, a look and a feel for the things that are ours. I can pull up code from people on my team and immediately identify who wrote it, and your visualization interpretation has that same effect and phenomenon. What that means for us, though, is that your first impression holds a lot of weight. There's something that can be said for accurate data presented poorly disqualifies what you're doing. And you've probably seen the flip side of that. Really sharp, clean presentation can overqualify bad code or inaccurate analysis. We have to be mindful of the fact that there's a behavioral aspect to what we're doing here, and that's something that's important for us to keep in mind as we're going through this. So as I'm switching away from the obstacles, what I really want you to understand and take away from this is that there is an interaction of behavior and psychology to what we do in solution building. And if we can understand that human element, we're going to have a lot more success in building things that are valuable and useful for people. Okay, so I want you to keep that in mind as we go forward. So where the work comes from, customer-driven versus developer-initiated. There's pros and cons to both of these, obviously, right? So we've got some examples up here. If it's a customer drive, we have ideally, or hopefully, more clarity around what it is that they want, right? So they give us those requirements. We can build towards those things. The con is that they might not know what it means to translate that data into that solution. They might not have an appreciation for the complexity. They might not understand whether the data actually supports that conclusion. And so we can get into a little bit of a difficulty there when we purely let the customer drive these requests. Now, on the flip side, which is my personal favorite, is the ideas that come from me or my development team because we are curious, we're in the data, we happened upon something that we think is valuable. Now, the flexibility there, the nice thing is we get to decide what the requirements are. So we're not beholden to a customer per se. The downside is you're going to have a lot more challenge to convince people to use that asset because it wasn't their idea in the first place. So if you do developer-driven, you have to make sure that what you're extrapolating out is very, very valuable because you're going to have to convince people to deal with that in an already busy world of the things that they're dealing with, right? Now, there's no right or wrong answer here. This is simply understanding the influencers over whether or not it comes from the customer versus the developer. But inherent in all of this is communication and collaboration, right? Regardless of who derives the work, we need to understand how to interact with the other side of the table so that we're creating investment, ownership, and buy-in for what we're building, right? And that's key to understanding the motives of the person, what their job is, what their problems are, and how we can try to help them solve it. As we go along here too, there's going to be some aspects of this that is trust building, right? So regardless of what you're doing, regardless of the problems you're solving for, we need to establish that relationship. It's a dance. We need to establish trust because if we don't have trust, there's going to be this doubt that bakes its way in. So we want to avoid that when solutioning. This is the area where I'm going to spend the most time. So this is the development cycle. You may have seen different derivatives of the development cycle, so it may be different from organization to organization how you do this. But essentially, at its core, we begin with the requirements gathering, right? We have to plan and design. We have to do the data preparation analysis, the solution build right at the bottom. That's where we're actually building the thing. We'll move into test validation, deployment, and then maintenance. In every one of these areas, there's opportunity for us to build investment for the sake of use. So begin with requirements gathering, right? This is our first spot where we get to communicate with that customer. And I think there's 3 areas that we can focus on here is identifying the need, obviously, but it's sort of the micro level, right? We're dealing with an individual or a team that has a need for a solution. We want to understand what their purposes are on a day-to-day basis. But we also need to zoom out with the alignment with goals. And that's your organization goals, right? So how do we build solutions that are going to solve the problem for the team, the people that are using it on a day-to-day basis? But how do we also zoom out to make sure that this meets our organization goals, our vision, our direction? We need to see if we can do our solution building to address both of those levels at the same time. I think you've all run into those situations where you have an individual who needs a solution and it's to help them individually, but it doesn't align up to any pillars or covenants or goals of your organization. And the question we have to ask ourselves is that going to create a solution that is going to get used long term, or is that really just a one-off report that needs to be delivered to the individual and it doesn't have any roll-up value? So we need to consider both of those things when we're choosing our projects. User-centric requirements, this is really, again, trying to understand how we can vacillate between the different levels of our audience. And for me, trying to take on a project is not just about the person who asked for it. It's trying to make it usable by as many people as possible, right? So there's a risk reward there. We can get a little out of scope, but the more people that we can invite in to use a solution, the higher usage rates that we're going to get, right? Sometimes the intended audience may not end up being the long-term audience, and that's okay. Planning and design, this is your storyboard, right? This is your mock-up, how you're going to solve the problem. This is what charts you're going to use. This, again, is trying to understand what the problem is, how to solve that for the customer, but choosing how you're going to create interaction. Is this going to be a dashboard where you have a few levers? Is this going to be an application where you're inviting information to be fed back into the database, to be churned back out in response? Again, that storyboard, making sure that we have some sense of a design and destination in mind. But key in the bottom right there is platform choice, right? I think we all work in organizations where we have a lot of options available to us. At Corewell Health, we have Alteryx, Tableau, we have the Snowflake environment for Streamlit, we have Power Apps, Power BI. So the problem that we run into sometimes is maybe the best solution we have to put on the shelf because we want to keep as many solutions in the same location. Maybe the platform has a key feature that says that this is the best platform for this solution because the other platforms simply don't do it. We need to weigh out the pros and cons of that when making these choices because, again, it influences choice, it influences use. We can build really, really complicated things in platforms that interactors are not inherently used to using, and that will decrease use. Data collection and preparation, the things that we can influence here for the sake of use is stable data pipelines, right? You may have worked with dashboards or applications that don't work, or they don't work reliably, or they take a long time to work. That experience from the user perspective will degrade how much it gets used, that investment, that buy-in. So we want to make sure that things aren't jumping from stage to stage to stage to another database, to another stage, to a refinement, through an application, through a workflow, automation, back to a dashboard, right? Many, 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 many breakpoints. Sometimes simple is better, even if we can create very robust solutions that look cool on the back end. If they have breakpoints, it's going to degrade confidence in your solution, and that lack of confidence is going to result in lack of use. The accuracy of the analysis obviously is key. We want to make sure it's accurate. This is the stage 2 where peer review is most important. A lot of times I see teams waiting for peer review into that user acceptance testing. This is where we want to make sure that our technical chops are up to snuff. This is where we make sure that the analysis is accurate so that when you move forward into visualization, that you're adding on top of that something that's fundamentally solving the problem in the first place. So does the data support the outcome? This is another spot. I struggled with a slide that we're going to get to around communication and feedback loops. I considered putting that first because I wanted to talk about the concept of that, but keep in the back of your mind here as we go through these slides, you're hearing me say it a lot, right? This collaboration, this is communication, this is checking in. And this is a spot where we can decide, is this project still viable? Right? Does the data support the outcomes or the assumptions of the hypotheses that our customer presented to us? And if it doesn't, we have to be willing to change. We have to be willing to modify the scope or abandon the project altogether. Because again, we don't want to create design debt here. If we do that, we're going to get caught in an endless cycle of development, and that elongation of the time frame, again, decreases use. The solution build, this is where we're putting all those concepts together. We're building the widget, the dashboard, the workflow, the automation, the application. We want to make sure that it's intuitive. We want to make sure that we're not eye-mugging people with a whole bunch of dense information, so there's a balance there. This is your artistic side. This is where you get to bring in the emotion of the reaction to the data with the visualization that you choose, the levers that you put in there, the prompts or the inputs. This is your interaction with that customer and whatever derivative you choose there. So know your audience, know what they like, know what they don't like. Make sure that you're consistent and clean in that delivery. You want to invite use by creating that emotional attachment to the visual interpretation of things, right? Testing and validation. So this tends to be the first spot where developers bring their solution to the customer. And this is what we call user acceptance testing or QA testing. And if this is the first time you're bringing your solution to your customer to check in with them, you're already behind. Because what will end up happening is they'll have new ideas. They'll scope creep on you. They will come up with new problems to solve. And then you'll have to go back to the beginning and redesign a whole bunch of things. So if you like efficiency in your development, then the inefficient part of collaboration and communication in more and more meetings is critically important to making sure that you don't get yourself wedged into a corner here by overdeveloping an idea that doesn't align or is ultimately modified or expanded upon by your customer. So make sure you're checking in regularly to avoid that phenomenon happening. I know I'm going a little fast here. I got my clock here, so we're trying to keep it moving here. At any point, too, if you have questions about these slides, there will be some time afterwards, and I will stick around as well. So if you feel like I'm flying a little bit, sorry. The deployment phase, this is ultimately where we are pushing the solution into our production environment, right? So we've probably had it in endeavor test, we've had that interaction, that collaboration, now we're ready to move that into its final state. Environment setup is really, really key here. Chances are, as an analytic department, you are beholden to your digital services or IS people for your environment setup. And they have as much to do with the success of your application or dashboard as you do on the design side. So going back to that platform decision, you also need to understand what environments are the most stable. For us, we're standing up Power BI. It would be really neat for us to put solutions into Power BI, but we're not confident yet that that environment is stable enough to support that so that we can instill that confidence with our customer base. So we have a tendency to revert over to Tableau or other solutions. And that's okay. You need to consider these things when you're making that selection of platform, but also making that selection of environment, especially if you have multiple environments that you can go to. The other side of this is, does your customer know where to find these solutions? If you have Streamlit and you have Power BI and you have Tableau and you have XYZ other solutions, and you build 10 over here, 5 over there, a couple over here, does your customer know that all those environments exist? Do they know how to find things? You don't want to create a scavenger hunt for your solutions. So asset awareness is understanding what's out there. So sometimes you build things and it was for one customer and a whole other group happens upon it. They find value in it. That's great. But how could you have promoted the use to a broader audience from the get-go? So that's what we think about when we say asset awareness. And then access and credentials is another thing that's really important. Who's going to have access to that data? How do you flow that data through your solution? Is it embedded credentials, pass-through tokens? Is it service accounts? Is it individual accounts? Those things matter because those will become breakpoints for your customers' usage. If they can't get at the solution, they'll stop using it. It'll be immediately gone from their mind, and it is very hard to get them to go back to that, especially if their first experience, that first impression is, it didn't work. It pulled up a screen that says, you don't have access. Nothing kills momentum more than credentials, and sometimes we need to be proactive about that from the development side. Maintenance is a big one, and I think this often gets overlooked. We spend so much time and energy in the collaboration side, the understanding the requirements, the development, the deployment, and then we sort of like wipe our hands of it. We leave that brown paper bag on the doorstep and we run, right? We're on to the next project. It's a big mistake, right? We want to make sure that we leave time in our development cycle to understand what are the things that we have to do long-term to keep this thing going. We may need to do design review. We may need to change things about it as data flows. The example that comes to mind for me was, back in COVID era, right? Healthcare. We all were like, hey, we're going to build a dashboard around COVID, and I need 2 weeks worth of data. And that's all I need. That's all I built for. And all of a sudden, 2 months later, all of the data was smushed because there was way more data than I had planned for in the space of the dashboard, right? And so I need to go back to things to make sure that they're not running overflowing with data, but at the same time that there's enough space to support the data that's being fed into it. So make sure that you're revisiting your solutions to ensure that they continue to provide value. Tracking usage is something interesting too, and you might be wondering, like, how does tracking the existing usage help me create more usage? Well, it helps us understand who is viewing it, what they're viewing, and how often they're viewing it, right? And that can give us some insights as to new users that might have happened upon that. When we talk about things like training and announcements and information around our assets, we can pick up on those new people and say, hey, I see that you visited this dashboard. What did you think? How did that go? What feedback might you have? How was this useful or not useful for you? I realize that you weren't the intended audience, but if you're finding value, are there things that we could make or change about that to expand our use case for the application, right? Adding a little bit with 10, 15% more development time is going to be way faster than starting from the ground up or scratch with that new customer audience, trying to get a solution that's going to be tailor-made for them. Chances are it has 60% overlap with the one you already made, right? So there's an efficiency there too. And then managing downtime, the things that you're aware of from environment downtime, unexpected or expected. We want to make sure that we have communication channels available to keep people informed so that they, ideally, you're proactively messaging to them as opposed to reacting. All right, so here's that slide I talked about. So agile, we're all familiar with that word, right? For some organizations, that's a little bit of a swear word, versus waterfall. Both of these methods can work, but you can see sort of in the example at the bottom with waterfall, if we don't make deliberate choices to communicate, we might get to the very end of all of our milestones in our development cycle, and that might be the first time that we solicit for feedback. And if that feedback yields, we have problems, this isn't what I asked for, this isn't what I wanted, or the conclusions aren't proving my gut, right? Then we might have to jump all the way back, and we've accumulated a lot of design debt. As opposed to the agile model, not from a Pi days or innovation standpoint, but I want to think about this from a flexibility standpoint. If we are maintaining an open communication feedback loop, we have the opportunity to iterate immediately as we become aware of information that could influence use and utilization of our asset. So my encouragement to you here is communicate often, because it will pay dividends in the long run. And I know that the last thing we want is more meetings and more conversation and Teams chats and emails, but it's critically important for you to decide whether or not you want to spend the time communicating now or whether you want to spend the time redeveloping later. Because if you don't have time to communicate today, you're definitely not going to think you've got time to redevelop, towards the end there, especially when your deadline is tighter. So now is the time to do that, often and always. So focus on value. I was going to call this slide value, 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 and then I realized it was sort of like 15, 20 values, and it just didn't fit, right? Start over on the far right-hand side, the chicken or the egg, right? When we think about value, if it's not valuable, it won't get used. If it's not used, it won't be valuable. So how do we break that continuum? How do we show people that there is inherent value in the solution so that they do use it? We need to make sure that we tie back to those goals and priorities. We talked about that, right? The solution must solve the problem. We can build things and fill white space with a whole bunch of different stuff, and if it doesn't fundamentally help you solve the problem, it's probably not going to be valuable to the customer. Therefore, it's not valuable use of your canvas space. Communicate and collaborate, I've beaten that one into the ground, I think. That data-driven decision-making and identifying inflection points. Sometimes we have to help the customer understand what to do in response to the data. And so when we're doing demonstrations, I will plant questions with other people that are in the room. I will come up with ideas around how I would use the data, and I will posit them as questions as we're doing the demonstrations to provoke people to think about how they could use the data. So it feels a little contrived at times, it feels a little bit staged, but what we're really doing is we're hacking people's behavior tendencies and their psychology to trick them into understanding the value of that asset, especially if they're coming from that imposter syndrome standpoint. They may not understand how to get to those results themselves, but if we can suggest a couple insights that we found, suggest a couple of questions that could be answered, we can start to provoke that curiosity out of our customers. Sometimes that can be as simple as, hey, we're watching this trend, and if it breaks this threshold, here's what I think you should do with that. Or if it drops below this amount, here's how I think you should react to that. Sometimes we get customers who ask a question, you've probably experienced this, like, I have a big decision to make, and I need the data to support that. And we say, great. Out of curiosity, if the amount came in here, here, or here, do you have a sense of what you would actually do at those 3 points? And if the answer is no, you know that you've got to lean in and do a lot more exploration with them to understand how they need to react to that data. But if they can understand and verbalize, well, if it comes in low, we will do nothing. If it comes in moderate, we'll initiate these teams to start tracking. And if it comes in high or bad, we will immediately do X, Y, or Z action. If you can get your customer to connect that way before you've even shown them the solution, you have key insight into how they're thinking about this problem, and you can tailor that build around that, thus creating higher usage. Reinforcement is big. So delivering the solution to the customer is just the beginning. That delivery may include trainings and demonstration. The engagement after deployment is sort of like your subscriptions and you're circling back around to them. We ultimately want to overcome that analytic insecurity or that imposter syndrome. So when we think about the delivery of a solution, right, if you have Tableau, for example, and your customer base is used to using Tableau, they may be aware of hoverovers and tooltips and drill downs and highlight filters and things like that. But if not, you need to teach them. And so that's part of that reinforcement after the fact. You can use the usage stats to understand who is engaging with your dashboard or your app or your solution. You can circle back around to them and you say, how's it going? What could we do better? What could we do differently? Is this solving your problem? We ultimately are working towards number 4, they're building trust to boost confidence, right? If your user trusts you as a developer or a team or your organization or department, you will have inherently higher utilization earlier on in the process. And if you don't, that's okay. You just need to understand how to start working towards that. So sometimes it's about letting the solution speak for itself, and sometimes it's about teaching them how to extrapolate the insights out of it. And that's really, really key if you're building solutions that are developer derived as a starting point as opposed to customer, right? So that there's a little bit of a difference there. All right, I think I'm doing good on time here, but I want to sort of wrap this up and close this into these 3 key points, right? So the first one you've heard me say, value, value, value. We need to tie things back to value. The solution needs to align up to organizational goals, and it needs to be useful for them or they're never going to use it. The second question I get around this is, do we have to do everything that this slide deck suggested to you? And the answer is no. But what it does give you the opportunity to understand is that there are many different spots along the way that you can influence one way or the other usage and utilization and engagement for your solutions. And if you want to have higher engagement and use, if you don't like getting to the end of the road, deploying that solution, going to the view and the usage and saying, hey, I've got 200 uses here. And then you go into who used it and you find that you're 90% of them as you were testing it, right? If you want to avoid that, then we need to consider every step of the way we have the ability to influence that. Again, you don't have to, but you should aspire to do as much as you can because you spent a lot of time, right? These are your babies, your solutions. You love them and you want to see them used and be valuable and important. And the best way to do that is to stack the deck in your favor, do everything that you can to promote the widest and most responsible usage. And it's worth the effort, right? There's the percentage down there. 15% more effort ensures that the other 85% wasn't wasted, right? The worst feeling in the world is to get to the end of the road there and to not have utilization or usage of your asset. It's deflating. And so when we put care and thought into how we're designing things, we're going to promote the most easy, low barrier to entry use of that asset so that they can ultimately do all the wonderful things that go along with solutioning, right? Which is data-driven decisions, it's autonomy, it's democratization, it's lowering the barriers, right? All of those feel-good things that we want to enable within our organizations. And the key to that is understanding how, again, behaviorally we can influence people's decisions around what they use and what they don't use to solve their problems. All right, I think I'm doing okay on time. So I want to leave a bit of two motives here, right? Lunch is coming, so I want to make sure that you get some seats. And 2, to be able to answer questions that you might have. So I can go back and forth on slides if you want. This is my LinkedIn. If you want to connect with me, I'd love to stay connected. If you want the slides, I'd be happy to forward them to you. Please feel free to reach out to me. But what questions can I answer from you all? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so the question is around asset awareness and strategies for raising that awareness. So part of this comes down to governance can help you, right? So if you have a cataloging tool where you can punch in keywords and search that can bring things up. Now that depends on the governance tool having a cataloging feature. It depends on you using appropriate words and terminologies for tags and associated words, derivatives. But the other thing that you can do from a development standpoint is one of the things that I like to do when I have a solution that's ready to be sent out is we'll all do those announcement emails and say, hey, I got a cool new thing, here it is. Mine tend to be like 3 pages long. Now that's overkill, but what I'm trying to do there is I'm trying to get people to emotionally connect to that resource, and then I'm trying to blast that to as many people as possible. The other thing that I like to do, which is sort of effectively like pulling a pin on a grenade, rolling it into a room, closing the door and walking away, is when I create solutions that are me derived, what I'm doing is I'm provoking a really radical response to something I found. And so I will just create it and I will subscribe people to it and I'll shove it in front of their face and I'll run and just wait for the noise to happen. Now, the customer hates that because you just added work to their already full plate, but sometimes your business needs you to do that, to be very provocative, to create something new. And I'm rambling on about your question there, but you can use all these different methods to get people curious about what you're doing by, again, hacking their behavior tendencies, by creating those emotional responses. It fundamentally creates curiosity, good or bad, but that's the way that we socialize these things. And again, to the platforms part of it, don't build them in all different platforms. Try and keep as many as possible in the same place because they'll accidentally happen upon them just by poking around. So that was a lot. I hope that answered your question. Other questions? Yeah, in the back.
Similar question, tips and strategies for maintenance, because that's something I could definitely improve on. The way our team is structured is that every quarter I have a project to create a new solution.
Yep.
Scale that out. The longer you work at an organization, the more solutions you're going to create, plus little ones in between.
100%.
And thinking about just going back and doing maintenance on every single one, sounds like it starts to become a full-time job after a while.
It does.
What are the best approaches for that?
Yeah, so the question is maintenance and strategies around managing the maintenance. And I love what you said there because I have a ownership and possessive problem for the things that I build, which means that I end up being the one maintaining them indefinitely. And that creates, like you said, a full-time job that you can't get out from underneath. So maintenance to me is scheduled routine checking that doesn't necessarily have to happen from you. It can happen from your customer, it can happen from you, it can happen from another developer. It's putting eyes on your solutions every so often to make sure that they're functioning and running. And I don't do spontaneity in that regard, so they are scheduled on my calendar to make sure that I'm looking at some percentage of my solutions at least every couple of months. That's the practical way of doing it. The other side of it, if you can get out of the possessive nature of what we create, is utilize other people. And something that I didn't necessarily talk about here that is near and dear to my heart is we all have the ability to create these incredibly awesome, complex solutions that are way above the skill set of the average rest of your team. You may want to downgrade your solution to make sure that it is portable, because portability means that other people can help you with the maintenance. So I might be able to do it in Python. I might be able to create a Streamlit application, but I might also be able to just do that in a Power App or a Tableau or a Power BI or an Alteryx workflow, that more people have an awareness at how to look at that, debug it, change it, fix it, update it. So if we downgrade ourselves a little bit, we create a larger pool to do that maintenance so that your awesome prototyping mind doesn't get stuck in maintenance mode forever. Great question. Thank you. Yeah?
For your tracking solutions, do you have ways to get down to the individual user to say, like, this person is using it?
Yeah, environment variables. A lot of the different platforms have environment variable functions that are built in that'll piggyback off of your now service accounts is where this breaks down, right? Where your solutions are using service accounts and then it's promoted up. But where you have individual access, I know Alteryx has an environment variable, Tableau can do it as well. I'm sure Power BI can. Again, I'm just getting into Power BI. But you can use that information and start to log that information behind the scenes, especially with Alteryx applications. You can create alternative pathways to log metadata over to a table so that you can create your own usage stats if you don't have access to the admin side. See who's using it, what they're using it for. You can program all of those things and to log whatever you want to see from a usage standpoint. If you don't have access to these things, usually you want to connect with your digital services or IS administrators. They can usually get you some reports and feedback on things. And I would say, you're 30, 60, 90 days out from deployment. Like we get hired into jobs and people check in with you every 30, 60, 90 days. Do the same thing with your digital solutions. Check on the usage every 30, 60, 90, then 6 months, and then however often after that. That's how I would approach that. Yes?
How do you track requirements and manage scope creep?
Yeah, we don't. No, I'm kidding. Tracking requirements, this is why I love to build things myself, because then when people say, hey, I saw this dashboard and it was really cool, but I wish it did this, I can say, well, it wasn't built for you. I'm kidding. Be clear upfront at what you're trying to solve for. Sometimes people say, hey, I need a report, I need a dashboard that shows this thing. And the best way to expand people's minds around that is to say, hey, where are you ultimately trying to go with this? What are you trying to solve for in the macro sense? Like, what decisions are you trying to make today? How is this data going to help you make those decisions? And then where are you ultimately going with this? What's your zoom out, your 50,000 foot level view? And if you can get them talking about that, you as a developer can start to understand what's going to be most important along the way in that journey. That's going to help avoid scope creep, where people do the thing that you do at restaurants, right? Like, I need more water, and then they come back, and then I need ketchup, and then they come back, and then I need this, and then they come back. Or we can say, hey, I need water, ketchup, an extra order of fries, and this, and they can go get it all in one shot and bring it back to you. It's a lot more efficient that way too, right? So if you can provoke a lot more of the destination up front, you will see less scope creep, and you will have clearer defined metrics right off the bat, and you will be able to invoke your own curiosity to say, I picked up on some things that were on where you're going, and I looked at the data, and I think it supports this thing, so I added this to it, made it more valuable, and then they love you better as a developer. I think those are the things that I would keep in mind to avoid scope creep and to make sure that we have a beat on requirements. Yeah.
Yes, I have a question on that. You mentioned like tying requirements to the organization goals. So I mean, how do you like perceive that any requirement of the project you are working on, or you're collecting requirement for,
Yeah.
is tying to the organization goal? Because, or is it like, if you first of all, how do you relate those two? And second thing is, if you feel like no, then how do you oppose the project, or?
Yeah, so the question is, how do you tie those individual requirements to the macro organization goals? You can do it yourself. You can put it on them too. You can. Now this is tricky, right? Because if you're a newer employee, or if you're, and I don't mean to be pejorative here, but if you're a lower titled analyst, you might not have the title clout to be able to push back on some of these things. That's where you bring, your other team members into play. But what I have a tendency to do is to say, hey, I love what you're doing here. Help me understand how this ties back to one of our pillars, right? One of our strategic initiatives, because I want to be able to socialize this constructively, so you can trick them into thinking that you're really leaning in. But what you're ultimately doing is preparing them to come right back around and say, so this really doesn't align to our organizational goals, and I'm concerned about prioritization. Can you help me understand how you think this fits up, stacks up against this other macro initiative? And if they say, well, it doesn't, it just supports what my team needs to do, then say, then it opens the conversation to say, we do have other priorities that are aligned to these other very objective listable things, and right now we're going to need to focus our time on those, and then time permitting, we'd love to get back to your requirements. So that's a way to navigate around that, but I would put a lot of the obligation on the customer themselves to present how it's tying back to the organizational goal, because it should be provoking to them that if it's not tying back to the organizational goal, maybe they shouldn't be asking for it in the first place. So again, hacking human behavior, you can sort of lead them there softly for the inevitable not going to do that project. If that's where you've got to be, right? Resources are finite and they are scarce. So we need to be responsible at the same time. So I hope that answers your question. That's how I would approach that anyway.
We never had those kind of situations, but I was just wondering that, does even organizations feel that way when you're working on a project? Does it actually, relate to or feed into the organization?
Yeah, it does happen. Trust me. I see my Trinity IHA friends back here, and they talked about getting leadership buy-in. Part of that leadership buy-in is ensuring that you have the ability to say no to projects that don't add value to the organization, even if they might have value for the individual. We have to be courageous enough to direct the organization in a responsible way, and our solutions are very much a part of that continuum. So I do think it's important. You will run into that at some point. I think we're probably at time, so if anybody has other questions, I will stay up here for a little bit, but thank you so much for joining me.